Okay, so picture this. It's the summer of 1969, and two Central American nations go to war. The conflict itself, it only lasted about 100 hours, but its name has echoed through history: the Football War. On the surface, it sounds like a simple, almost unbelievable story, a war triggered by the passion for a beautiful game.
Yeah, the whole thing supposedly came to a head during a super dramatic World Cup qualifier between El Salvador and Honduras. The story that gets told is that the emotions from this single game just boiled over and led to an armed conflict. But is that what really happened?
You know, for half a century, that's been the story everyone tells. It's a simple, kind of crazy tale of a soccer match just completely escalating into combat.
But what if that simple story isn't the real story at all? What if the game wasn't the cause, but just the final explosive spark? What if the real story is about a powder keg that had been filling up for decades? To really get what happened, we've got to look completely away from the football pitch. We need to turn our attention to the much deeper, much messier issues of land, economics, and migration. So look at this imbalance. It's pretty stark. You've got El Salvador, the smallest nation in Central America, and it's absolutely packed with people. Most of the good farmland is owned by a tiny, wealthy elite. And then right next door, you have Honduras, 5.5 times bigger, with 1 million fewer people. It was vast and relatively empty. This setup created, well, an enormous pressure cooker in El Salvador. And all that pressure had to go somewhere, right? So over the years, something like 300,000 Salvadoran campesinos, that's peasant farmers, they did the logical thing. They crossed the border into Honduras, looking for land, for a chance to make a living.
You can kind of see how it happened. For generations, Salvadorans just settled across the border, often on land nobody was even using. They became a really productive part of Honduran society. But as you can imagine, this also started to create some friction. Some Hondurans began to resent what they saw as outsiders competing for their resources. And it wasn't just about land. On top of all that, you had this economic tension. See, El Salvador had a more developed industrial economy, so it was really benefiting from something called the Central American Common Market. They were selling all these manufactured goods to Honduras, which created this big trade imbalance. And in Honduras, that started to feel a lot like they were being exploited. It all finally came to a head in the late 60s. The Honduran government started to enforce a new land reform law, and this law basically forced Salvadoran farmers off the land they'd been working for years. This triggered a huge refugee crisis. We're talking tens of thousands of people forced back into an already overcrowded El Salvador, and as you can guess, that sparked some serious outrage back home. And it's right at this absolute breaking point that, you guessed it, football comes back into the picture. The two nations just happened to be scheduled for a 3-game World Cup qualifying series. It was the perfect stage for all this nationalism and anger to just explode. And it got ugly fast. The first game in Honduras was incredibly hostile. The second game in El Salvador was even worse. We're talking widespread rioting. By the time they played the third and final match in neutral Mexico City, the sport itself was almost forgotten. It was all about the intense, raw animosity between the two countries. But think about the players for a second. Here they are, just guys who want to play football, and they're caught right in the middle of a political firestorm that was way, way bigger than any game. I think this quote from El Salvador's captain, Salvador Mariona, is so telling. He says that on the field, the players respected each other, that their friendship actually endures to this day. It just shows you this huge disconnect between what was happening between the players on the pitch and the nationalist fury being whipped up everywhere else. So where was all that fury coming from? Well, a huge part of it was the media. Newspapers on both sides were running these sensational, often completely fabricated stories of atrocities. They were basically demonizing the other nation, stirring up so much hate that a peaceful resolution became almost impossible. And this is the moment it all became official. On the very same day that El Salvador won that final match, their government cut all diplomatic ties with Honduras. The path to war was now wide open. And sure enough, less than 3 weeks later, all those simmering tensions finally boiled over into open warfare. On July 14th, 1969, the conflict began. El Salvador launched a surprise attack. Their air force bombed key targets, and their army invaded on 2 fronts. Honduras fought back hard, and for 4 days, these two small, pretty poorly equipped armies just went at it in some really ferocious combat, until finally, the Organization of American States stepped in and managed to broker a ceasefire.
And here's a really fascinating little detail from all this. This war was one of the last times in history that you saw old World War II-era propeller planes, like these P-51 Mustangs, actually engaging in aerial dogfights. Kind of wild, right?
The fighting might have only lasted 100 hours, but the consequences? Oh man, the consequences would go on to destabilize the entire region for decades to come. The most immediate, devastating impact was a massive humanitarian crisis. Hundreds of thousands of Salvadorans were now refugees, creating this incredible strain on El Salvador's already limited resources. But the long-term damage was somehow even worse. The war completely shattered the region's economy. It took more than 10 years just to sign a formal peace treaty. And crucially, all the instability and social unrest that the war created helped set the stage for El Salvador's absolutely brutal 12-year civil war. So let's circle back. Was it really a soccer war? I think this quote from a Salvadoran editor just says it all perfectly. To blame this war on a football game, well, it's like saying World War II started because Hitler was a failed artist. It's just nonsense. It's a catchy name that completely hides a much deeper, much more tragic reality. And that really leaves us with a final thought, doesn't it? The football war is such a powerful reminder that history is rarely as simple as a catchy headline. It kind of challenges us to always look beyond the easy answer and to ask ourselves, what other stories have we just accepted without ever knowing the full picture?